Welcome to Cinemassacre's Monster Madness. Here we will be covering the basic history of horror films. For our first review, let's go back to the year 1920 with the German expressionist classic, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. The cabinet contains the sleepwalker Caesar, controlled by the mad magician Caligari, who commands him to kill all those he seeks vengeance upon. This theme of a mad doctor or villain taking control of a monster has been recycled countless times throughout horror movies. Also, the monster often falls in love with a girl who he has no business with, and this becomes his downfall. It's the classic Beauty and Beast story used in tons of monster movies, most notably King Kong. So besides being one of the first horror films and having influenced a whole genre, it was also important to film in general for its surreal visuals and cryptic storytelling. The whole movie is told from the point of view of an inmate from an asylum. So not only is the story vague, but everything we see is distorted. Shadows are painted across the floor, things bend at weird angles, windows are anything but square. Watching the movie is like going into a dream world, and up till then, movies usually depicted a setting in reality, but this is fantasy, and that happens to be an important aspect to the horror genre. Still in the early stages of our history of horror films, the year is 1922, the place is Germany, and this is Nosferatu. Nosferatu was one of the first movies to create the signature of one of the most classic and recognizable horror movie icons of all time, the vampire. But this isn't just any vampire, this is Dracula. However, unable to get the rights to Dracula from Bram Stoker's widow, director F.W. Murnau changed the character's name to Orlok, though most American prints I've seen still say Dracula. Anyway, this is one of the creepiest old movies you will ever see. From beginning to end, it has this eerie mood that never lets up. With so many contemporary horror films relying on loud noises to scare you, this one has this subtle quietness. And after all, it is a silent film, but that just enhances the atmosphere and it makes you feel like you're in a nightmare. That wicked shadow ascending the staircase, the shape of Dracula coming through the doorway, which just fits his body, these are images that you don't forget. They've all become popular screenshots for decades to come, and perhaps the rest of time. Also, check out Shadow the Vampire. It's a work of fiction, but it takes a look behind the making of Nosferatu, but in which Murnau hires a real vampire to play the part. Well, for all we know, it could have been true. As we've seen, the German horror films of the 1920s were usually based on the supernatural, but the American horror films were mostly about human deformities and often taken from literature, especially the ones from Universal Studios like The Phantom of the Opera. What made this film so great? Well, it had a pretty cool color sequence, but what really made it great, 2 words: Lon Chaney. Aside from being one of the greatest actors of the silent era, he also did his own makeup. Look at that face. The characters Chaney portrayed earned him the nickname Man of 1,000 Faces. His portrayal of the Phantom is the best ever in my opinion because he does so without any spoken dialogue, so it's completely a visual performance. He was an actor truly made for the silent era. After all, his parents were deaf and he mastered the art of communication through body language. Now that's scary. Look at that maniacal laugh. At first he seems just like a vengeful monster, but as the film progresses, you begin to feel he's just a confused and sad misfit who doesn't know what to do with himself. Underneath that hideous makeup, you can read his facial expressions and sympathize with his character. You can feel his jealousy and rage. Damn, he's pissed. Lon Chaney is also well known for playing Quasimodo in The Hunchback of Notre Dame. In this film, he demonstrated some great acrobatic skills. Also, he played a vampire in London After Midnight. No known copy of this film has survived, and today, it's the holy grail of horror classics. With the dawn of the sound era, Chaney was asked to play Dracula in Universal Studios' remake, but he died of throat cancer in 1930. Ironic that he passed away with the silent cinema, but what would come in his place is one of the most iconic horror stars of all time in the first sound horror movie, and we'll talk about that next time. We just got through the silent movies. Now with the birth of sound movies, we have the birth of a new era, the Universal Studios horror cycle. This is the golden age where all the classic monsters made their eternal marks. The first was Dracula, and it's got all the elements of a proper chiller. Fog, bats, crumbling castles, cobwebs, possums, and bees. But anyway, the main attraction of this movie is Hungarian actor Bela Lugosi. Lugosi only learned the English language for the roles he played on stage and on the screen. The rhythm and accent of his voice would forever become the way Dracula talked. Though he wasn't the first Dracula, he was the first in setting the popular image and folklore of the character. He was surely the best Dracula there ever was or will be, and if you have any doubt about that, he was buried in the cape. Now that's commitment. He just has this evil presence, and when he starts staring at you like that, you know you're fucked. Man, Dracula's a pimp. Dwight Frye is also great as the crazy Renfield. The movie has a slow but creepy, dreamlike atmosphere to it. Because it's the first sound horror movie, they didn't think to add music, so when there's no dialogue, there's hardly any audio whatsoever, but that only adds to the creepy atmosphere, making it the definitive chiller and the best Dracula movie. Following its success, the studio decided to make Frankenstein, the classic tale of a scientist who dares to play God and create a human being. Bela Lugosi, fresh off of Dracula, was asked to play the monster, but the part wasn't appealing to him. His face would be covered in pounds of makeup and he wouldn't have any dialogue, so he refused. The role was handed over to Boris Karloff, who became one of the most famous horror stars to ever live and perhaps the most famous movie monster of all time. Since the film's release, audiences called the monster Frankenstein, even though the name belongs to the scientist. In the films, the monster itself is usually referred to as Frankenstein's monster, the Frankenstein monster, or just the monster. However, the confusion has lasted to this very day. The look of the monster, which everybody recognized, was created by makeup man Jack Pierce. In Mary Shelley's original novel, the monster's description is pretty vague, so it was all invented for the movie. While the movie's criticized for not doing the novel justice, it is responsible for putting Frankenstein into the pop culture. For example, Dr. Frankenstein the movie has a hunchback assistant. That now has become a staple in movies, cartoons, and all media. Nobody can forget the images from this film. Even if you haven't seen the movie, you're probably familiar with it. From beginning to end, every scene is memorable. Frankenstein and his assistant digging up the corpses, the laboratory with all those crazy electronic gadgets, the lightning, the little girl by the pond, the angry village people chasing the monster with torches, and of course some of the most famous movie lines ever spoken. The movie has been parodied and imitated countless times over the decades. The sequel, Bride of Frankenstein, sticks closer to the novel, and this time gives the monster a voice. The film makes you sympathize more with the monster, and it's a lot more emotional, yet all around superior to the first movie. It also introduces one of the greatest mad doctors ever, Dr. Pretorius, played by Ernest Thesiger. Boris Karloff would once again play the monster in Son of Frankenstein, which some feel is the best of all of them due to Bela Lugosi's fantastic performance as Igor. Basil Rathbone's also great as the Son of Frankenstein. After this film, Karloff would step down for other actors to play the monster, but the mark he made is legendary. Fresh off his success as the monster in Frankenstein, Boris Karloff went on to play the Mummy, so he was the first in portraying two of the most imitated movie monsters of all time. Don't be fooled, the Mummy doesn't spend the whole movie wrapped in bandages going around killing people. Most of the movie he's actually unwrapped, trying to raise his mummy princess from the dead. But when he finds out that she has a living reincarnation, he instead tries to kill her and make her a living mummy like himself. The movie is a unique sort of horror story. It's often called a love story that's lasted for thousands of years, and the movie has a creepy, hypnotic feel. One of my favorite parts is the flashback describing how the mummy Imhotep was buried alive for breaking into the princess's tomb to try to resurrect her. And to keep the location secret, the men who buried her were killed. It may be the first impaling ever shown on screen. One thing that makes this movie special is that there were no sequels, not unless you count The Mummy's Hand, The Mummy's Tomb, The Mummy's Ghost, and The Mummy's Curse, but these followed a different mummy named Charis, controlled by the Egyptian priests seeking revenge on those who robbed their sacred tombs. This mummy stays in its bandages, it never speaks, and it mindlessly kills people. We started getting into the universal horror cycle, but here's one from Paramount, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. In this movie it's pronounced Jekyll, but whatever. Frederick March is fantastic as the Doctor and his alter ego. The production value is top-notch, the foggy street corners, gas lamps, and gothic architectures all look great. There's lots of nice camera work with some ambitious point-of-view shots. Then the transformation of Mr. Hyde is one of the strangest special effects I've ever seen. The makeup was already on his face, but only by applying different lights and filters you can see it appearing. For 1932, it must have looked pretty realistic. What really steals the whole show is Mr. Hyde. He's such an asshole. He does whatever he wants. Even in a public place, nobody ever attempts to call the cops on him. The rape scenes alone must have been enough to give it an X rating, but of course there were no ratings back then. I actually find it quite amazing how he can talk with those huge teeth in his mouth. And look how acrobatic he is. Wow, look at him go. He's like a monkey on drugs. Mr. Hyde is awesome, and so is this movie. Got a good one for you today. It's going to be a howl. It's The Wolfman from 1941. The Wolfman was played by Lon Chaney Jr., following in the footsteps of his father, the Man of a Thousand Faces. Originally, the movie was meant to be all psychological, like we never actually see the werewolf. We're not supposed to know whether or not he's really turning into a wolf, or he's just losing his mind. But to make a bigger buck, it was eventually decided to just show the werewolf. Two things you'd expect to see from a werewolf movie is a good transformation sequence and a shot of the full moon. You don't get either, and there's lots of weird continuity issues. But where this movie shines is in its creepy atmosphere, its foggy streets and forests, and some classic dialogue. And Chaney's performance as both Larry Talbot and the Wolfman is extraordinary. What I like about this movie is that it's about the beast within. It's not like Dracula or Frankenstein. The Wolfman is just a regular guy with an animal inside. Because of this movie, Lon Chaney Jr. quickly became the biggest horror star of the 1940s, and throughout various sequels to many films, ended up playing Frankenstein's monster, the Mummy 3 times, Alucard, the son of Dracula, and the Wolfman 4 more times. Frankenstein meets the Wolfman put the two monsters together in a battle to the death. Ironically, the monster was played by Bela Lugosi a decade after he first turned down the role. When this proved to be a smash hit, Universal brought Dracula into the mix and the Monster Mash franchise was born. The Wolfman, Dracula, and the Frankenstein monster appeared in 3 films together, often with mad doctors, hunchbacks, over-the-top comic book style storylines, and 2 of the greatest comedians of all time, Abbott and Costello. One trademark that finally came into play was the werewolf transformation effects. Chaney would have to stay still for hours and hours while the makeup was gradually applied to his face. That's stop motion, baby. That's old school. The Wolfman's a first-rate chiller and the sequels are good fun. Check them out. They'll grow some hair on your balls. We're going to wrap up the 1940s. Universal Studios was the grand champion, the monster movie factory. They had big stars, big music, big storylines that flowed like comic books. These movies were entertaining commercial blockbusters. But on the other side of the spectrum, there was RKO. Using low budgets and sets left over from previous films, RKO made some horror films of their own. The studio hired producer Val Lewton, and they gave him the titles. Here, make a movie called Cat People. Lewton would use whatever titles, but make a completely different picture than they'd imagine. If you watch this movie, you might be disappointed that there's no cat people. You never actually see anything supernatural, but this is one of the first films to realize that what you don't see is often scarier than what you do see. It's really clever because I can notice at least 3 different touches that make this work. First of all, it's a long period of silence, then suddenly there's a loud noise. Every horror film does this nowadays. Second, the sound of the bus actually resembles the hiss of a panther or some kind of large cat. So for a brief moment, that's what we expect to see. And third, right before the bus comes, notice how she looks to the side. She's off center of the frame, and naturally this draws her eyes to the left side of the screen. Then suddenly, a large object rushes in from the right side. Seeing it on a 4-inch YouTube screen doesn't help, but on a big screen, and in 1942, you would have shit your pants. We started with the silent horror films of the 1920s, we made our way through the classic chillers of the 1930s and the monster mash from the 40s. After World War II, monster movies were no longer scary. People were obviously more afraid of the horrors of real life. So with the atomic age, a new genre of science fiction cinema was born. This was the B-movie age. The 1950s were all about monsters. Monsters created by scientific experiments, born from nuclear radiation, or alien invaders. We had giant ants, giant spiders, giant Gila monsters, killer brains, Godzilla, and, oh god, There's a lot of good monster movies to pick from, but I'm going to go with The Creature from the Black Lagoon. The Creature, or Gillman as he's called, is so popular that he's often considered to be the last of the Universal Studio monsters. The creature on land was played by Ben Chapman, and underwater, Rico Browning, who had to hold his breath for 4 minutes at a time while wearing the creature suit, and neither one of these guys were included in the film's credits to give a little more mystery to the creature. The cinematography was brilliant, especially the underwater stuff, which was pretty innovative for its time. I dare to say it would look good in color, but the black and white tones sure do look gorgeous. The movie was originally shown in 3D. That would have been neat. Julia Adams is the creature's love interest, and again, if he would have just stayed in the water, he would have been fine. But then again, those scientists had no business in his lagoon. 2 sequels were made, Revenge of the Creature and The Creature Walks Among Us. And to close this review, I got a nice little piece of trivia for you. Revenge of the Creature marks the screen debut of Clint Eastwood. Well, a lot of people know that, but here's something else. In Back to the Future 3, Marty's getting ready to go back to the Old West. At the moment, it's supposed to be 1955. That's the year Revenge of the Creature came out.
Clint Eastwood never wore anything like this.
And what's that? Revenge of the Creature. Nice touch. The review of the day is The Tingler. Horror legend Vincent Price plays a doctor who makes an outrageous discovery. When you're scared, you know that tingly feeling you get in your spine? Well, that's a parasite, a creature called the Tingler, which lives in your vertebrae. It feeds and grows on fear, but luckily our bodies were built with a defense mechanism, screaming. Screaming is what stops the Tingler from growing. The doctor tries a deadly experiment on an innocent woman who's deaf and mute. The doctor gives her LSD and makes her have a horrible trip. It's a really weird scene with some color parts, and maybe the first drug trip ever depicted on film. But anyway, she can't scream, so the Tingler is able to grow. At parts, the movie would stop in a gimmick to encourage the audience to scream. The theater seats were rigged with back vibrators to make you feel the Tingler. There would also be actors playing in the audience fighting with the Tingler itself. This is the work of William Castle. He is the man responsible for turning the movie theater into a funhouse. For House on Haunted Hill, he had a glow-in-the-dark skeleton swing across the audience's head. Later, when people knew about it, kids would show up to the movie with slingshots and shoot rocks at it. This was when movies were fun. They were drive-in theaters, movies in 3D, live performers. It must have been great, but now, it's just a thing of the past. We've seen that the 1930s and 40s were the golden age of grade A chillers, but the 50s were more about the atomic age, giant tarantulas, alien invaders, and science experiments gone completely wrong. There were all kinds of B-movies, but not really any genuine horror films. Even the William Castle flicks were kind of tongue-in-cheek. They were just fun. This is where Hammer Films came into play. Hammer was a studio in England who are responsible for putting the horror back into horror. They remade all the classics like Dracula, Frankenstein, and The Mummy. But now there was color, there was blood, and there was cleavage. By today's standards, it's pretty tame, but back then, it was hardcore. What really put them on the map and made a star out of Christopher Lee was their Dracula series. Horror of Dracula, Dracula Prince of Darkness, Dracula Has Risen from the Grave, Taste the Blood of Dracula, Scars of Dracula, Dracula AD 1972, and The Satanic Rites of Dracula. These movies earned Christopher Lee the reputation as being the second best Dracula. Lugosi set the image and the voice, but Lee, he was badass. Look at that face. Try to stab him with a wooden stake? He'll just throw that shit right back at you. And as usual, Dracula sure knows how to get the ladies. Dracula's a pimp. How many ways can a vampire die? Well, if you watch all these movies, you'll find out. He gets sunburned, drowned, stabbed, electrocuted, damn! Dracula gets all fucked up. Parallel to the Dracula series was Hammer's Frankenstein series. Unlike the ones from Universal, which followed the monster as a central character, these ones follow Dr. Victor Frankenstein, who creates a different monster in each movie. The Doctor's played by Peter Cushing, possibly the best ever. Usually Dr. Frankenstein's depicted as being guilty for his creation, an accident, but here, he's just one malicious bastard. All he cares about is his work, and he doesn't give a shit who he's got to kill. Not only is he a mad doctor and a murderer, he's a rapist too. I like the old-fashioned look of his laboratory and just the sense of the crude science that's going on. If you're looking to find them, the films are The Curse of Frankenstein, Revenge of Frankenstein, Evil of Frankenstein, Frankenstein Created Woman, Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed, and Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell. The monster in the final film was played by Dave Prowse, who looks like a bald gorilla. Dave Prowse, of course, would later be cast as Darth Vader, alongside once again Peter Cushing. How ironic. But then, what do you get when you take Count Dracula and give him a lightsaber? You get Count Dooku. Somebody was a fan, and I don't blame him, because these movies are awesome. The 1960s were the age of elaborate gothic thrillers. One man who actually made the transition is Roger Corman. He started off making low-budget B-movies in the 50s and early 60s, more than you can possibly count. Then he got his big break and started making bigger-scale horror films based on the tales of Edgar Allan Poe. To this day, Roger Corman has made 100 billion movies. Well, maybe not that much, but a lot. Today, we're not going to talk about any one specific film, but a general impression of his Poe series that ran through the 60s. Bringing the writings of Poe to the big screen has never been done perfectly because it's hard to do justice to his work, and this wasn't the first time it's been attempted. In the 1930s, Universal Studios made The Black Cat and The Raven, both starring Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff. This was the first time the two actors were paired together. While these were great flicks, with top-notch performances and suspenseful plots of rivalry and revenge, they had little to do with the stories of Poe. Besides, adapting a short story or poem into a feature film isn't easy. So the Roger Corman films did a good job retaining Poe's original ideas, but also had the flexibility to invent. They more or less paid tribute to Poe rather than being literal screen translations. They might have been a little weak on plot, but they made up for it and excelled in creating atmosphere, a sense of humor, and bringing together a brilliant cast. Vincent Price was the recurring star to lead the whole franchise. Then we would have two classic horror stars nearing the end of their career, Boris Karloff and Peter Lorre. Then, before he was a big star, there was Jack Nicholson. This wasn't the first time Nicholson made an appearance in a Roger Corman film. Earlier, he played a part in Little Shop of Horrors. This ensemble of big names brought together in the Roger Corman Poe series definitely makes it one of the important eras in our history of thriller films. Most of the movies we've talked about are supernatural, monsters, vampires, werewolves, things that can't happen in real life. But Psycho deals with the beast that lies within the mind. I don't think it comes as any surprise that the star, Janet Leigh, is murdered early in the film. The shower scene, as it's always called, is one of the most famous movie moments and has been imitated and parodied countless times. It was shocking and innovative for its violence, yes, for its tight editing, yes, for being called the first slasher film, yes, but the reason being is that nobody expected this to happen. Before 1960, you don't kill the main character in the beginning of the movie. Director Alfred Hitchcock had some balls, and he stood firm and did not let theaters allow entry to the movie after it started because he didn't want people showing up late wondering where Janet Leigh was. Hitchcock was already established as the master of suspense and one of the greatest directors of all time. His movies are full of unique twists, psychological storylines which reflect his own personal fears, and a subtle, dark blend of humor. To describe the ingenuity of Psycho as a whole, I would have to reveal the whole plot, and that I'm not going to do, because if you haven't seen this movie, you should check it out. Halfway through our history of horror films, and the movie of the day is Night of the Living Dead. Ironically, I always think of this as the middle ground of the horror movie timeline. It was the first to depict gruesome acts of violence such as zombies getting stabbed, flesh getting eaten, and guts all over, but it's shot in black and white even though color was available, so it's kind of like a crossover between classic chillers and modern splatter flicks. It's a little tame for today's standards, but back then it was definitely a turning point in horror history and movies in general. A month after Night of the Living Dead's premiere, the American rating system came into effect. Whether or not it had anything to do with it, it was the first and last horror movie of its kind to receive an attendance of pre-teens and adolescents without restriction, and nobody knew what hit them. The film was also innovative for its casting decisions. Back then, a black man in a starring role was actually unheard of. So here's a movie that finally decided to break down the boundaries. It was also one of the first independent films to gain worldwide popularity. The appeal of this movie is in its cheap, low-budget, and realistic setting. The black and white shitty look just adds to the flavor, and the title is one of the best titles ever, Night of the Living Dead. Living contradicts being dead, but it also just has this creepy ring to it, and it ushered in countless titles beginning with Night of or ending in dead. It also has one of the best opening scenes of all time. Any other horror movie back then would have probably spent the first act explaining why the dead are rising and set it all up, but this movie just hits you right off the bat. The way the film plays is that everyone is trapped inside this one house trying to stay safe from the zombies outside. If they can learn to work together, they might make it out alive, but they can't stop arguing. It's an interesting study of human behavior and survival instincts. What it comes down to is that everyone is for themselves. Director George Romero had made a movie that no one else dared to make, and unknowingly, he created one of the biggest subgenres in horror films, the zombie flick. I'm not going to give away the ending, but what I will say is that it has balls. Romero actually had an opportunity to sell his film to a major studio, but they wanted him to change the ending and add a love story subplot. He said no. He's always stayed away from the mainstream because he's a true filmmaker and he has balls. And balls are what this genre is all about. So where'd we leave off? I think I was saying that horror movies have a lot of balls. Well, this one is pure balls to the wall, vomit-inducing, screaming, bloody horror. By all definition of the word horror, this is a horror movie. But for a genre that doesn't always get a lot of respect, this one is always considered a film legend. It won some Oscars and Golden Globes and all that shit, and it's always referred to as the scariest movie ever made. You may or may not agree, but back in 1973, there was no comparison. Now that's some freaky deaky shit. The special effects are a real show stealer, and I can't show you the best of it. One reason is that it gets so graphic that I might be crossing the line, and I also feel that I'd be doing an injustice to the film by spoiling it. Today, the breath, that fog you see, it would have been CG, but that room was really that cold. My favorite scene is actually the opening. It has such an eerie mood. You can tell some bad stuff is going to happen. The movie does a great job at grossing out and shocking its audience, but how it affects you on a deeper level is a personal experience. The question is, do you believe in the devil? Well, anyway, it might not be the scariest movie of all time, but it's still pretty damn scary, and when you see that face coming into your dreams, you'll know what I'm talking about. During the 1970s, there were a lot of low-budget exploitation movies being made. An exploitation movie is defined as a movie that doesn't aim for quality, but rather using main selling points such as sex and violence. Movies like these were usually shown late at night and as double features in what they call grindhouse theaters. And now we come to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, a true horror movie in terms of the word horror. One thing that this movie is not is a gore fest. Despite its title, there aren't many chainsaw deaths and not as much blood as you'd expect. The reason why it's so effective at terrifying its audience is due to many things. One, it has a realistic look where being outdated actually helps. In an American movie, Mark Borchardt says that it reminds you of something you see in science class, and I think I know what he means. It has this old grainy look. The camera work's really raw, it almost has a documentary feel, and it begins with the text and stock sounding narrator, which sets you in the right mood that what you're watching is a true story. In reality, it was only loosely based on serial killer Ed Gein, the same guy Psycho was based on. Another thing that makes the movie so effective is its location, a deserted area of Texas. It creates a scary atmosphere where nobody can help you and you can't trust anybody you meet. A group of friends arrive during a road trip. They pick up a hitchhiker, which is always a big mistake. Then they go check out an old farmhouse, which is an even bigger mistake. The conventions may seem pretty cliche now, but the pacing here really works. Watching the movie from beginning to end is like having a nightmare. The tension just builds and builds, and the last chase scene is just incredible. This isn't about vampires or zombies or the devil, it's about real psychopaths. What makes this movie so scary is not about whether or not it really happened, it's that it could happen. We're taking a look at the terrors from the sea. The monster, of course, is a killer shark, one that made people afraid to go in the ocean. What really makes it scary is that you don't see the shark a whole lot, but you feel its presence whenever that creepy John Williams music starts playing. It does a good job building tension and it lets you know that the shark is near, but then there's times when the music isn't playing, when you're not supposed to know. It scares the shit out of you. So the movie succeeds in both suspense and shocks. The setting itself is terrifying, being in the middle of the ocean where nobody can help you, not knowing when the shark's gonna come. The first half of the movie is just a setup to when they're hunting the shark. Once they get on that boat, the the movie officially begins, and from there, the tension just accelerates to a thrilling climax. Jaws was the first movie to make over 100 million US dollars, which started the notion of the summer blockbusters, and it launched the career of Steven Spielberg, but that's not why we care about it. We care because it kicks some serious ass. We're in the late 70s now in our history of horrors. The box office is dominated by all the new blockbusters, movies like Jaws and Star Wars. Big movies like these were all the craze. But here comes along Halloween, independent, super low budget, but nobody would expect it to become one of the most successful independent films of all time. Not only was it a smash hit, it started the slasher genre. Not that the groundwork wasn't already established, but Halloween brought the formula to the mainstream and set the rules for the genre. A slasher movie is defined as a movie with a body count, a killer who sneaks about and murders all the main characters one after another. After all the sequels, rip-offs, and the remake, many people forget what the original was like. One thing, there was no blood, or hardly any, nothing graphic. Halloween uses suspense and atmosphere as its tool. The soundtrack is one of the most recognizable and effective horror scores ever conceived. Donald Pleasence is fantastic as Dr. Loomis. Jamie Lee Curtis is also great as Laurie Strode, the Scream Queen as she's known. Her mother Janet Leigh is also famous for Psycho. But the most celebrated character in this film is the killer Michael Myers, whose face is always covered by a mask, a William Shatner mask painted white. Well, this character is so popular that he just can't be left alone. Halloween 2 killed him off, and Halloween 3 started fresh. Originally, the series was meant to be a different Halloween-themed story each time. Think about it, the title is Halloween. There's a million things that could happen on Halloween, so part 3 was a completely different subject. There's even a scene where they're watching the first Halloween as sort of a joke or a tribute. But everybody hated it, not so much whether or not it was a good movie, but the problem was everybody was confused why Michael Myers wasn't in it. So due to the audience's demand, they brought him back for a never-ending string of sequels, and recently a remake. It all started as a little independent film, but now it's been raped into a franchise. A decade after George Romero shocked the world with Night of the Living Dead, he does it again with a color sequel which also stands on its own. The cast is new, it doesn't require seeing the first movie, the backstory is the same. There's an epidemic of zombies walking around eating people, and everybody tries to survive. A group of people hide out in a shopping mall, which is the perfect setting because all the stores offer great scenarios and comedic effect. Just the idea of having a whole mall to yourself is great fun. It's like being a kid in Willy Wonka's chocolate factory. But besides all that, some interpret it as social satire, comparing mall shoppers to zombies. But it just seems they had a lot of fun making this movie, and that fun transcends onto the audience. For its time, it might have been the goriest, bloodiest film ever made, which disgusted many audience, but those who were bold enough to sit through it could probably see the humor behind a lot of it, and how creative a lot of the special effects are. This is the early work of Tom Savini, who also acts in the film. To this day, he's one of the most famous faces in the horror business. Romero followed up with Day of the Dead in 1985 and Land of the Dead in 2005. What's interesting is that each movie really seems to represent the decade in which they were made. If you like horror movies at all, don't miss these, because these are awesome. But let's take a look back at the 50s for one brief moment. What do we usually see? Monsters that come from outer space. Either the aliens come to us, or we come to the aliens. Well, the movie Alien is basically a big-budget modern remake of a 50s B-movie. It's almost a remake of It, The Terror from Beyond Space. It involves a journey through space in which a hostile alien creature hides aboard the ship, and it kills the crew one by one. Essentially, Alien is a slasher movie set in outer space. It employs all the elements of the genre. It has those moments when you know the alien is around, but you don't know when it's going to come out. Once it builds as much tension as possible, something suddenly pops up that's not the alien. It's a false climax. There's moments which you anticipate it for so long, and then when you least expect, that's when it strikes. And the last act of the film is usually spent with one character trying to escape. Just like in Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Halloween, the last surviving character is a woman. She's the only one smart enough, brave enough, or lucky enough to put up a chase and get away, where most of the characters just get killed off. But the really cool thing, the alien plants an egg inside your body. It's a convincing concept that some kind of species would do that, and I can't think of anything more terrifying than having a living creature inside you just waiting to burst out. Another thing at work here is the setting. The whole movie takes place isolated inside this spaceship. The idea of being alone and hunted in this claustrophobic environment, it's been used in many films and video games such as Metroid. It's a scary concept, and as the tagline says, in space, no one can hear you scream. We've made it to the 80s and the slasher genre is in full motion. Friday the 13th does everything that Halloween already did. The point of view shots, the young adults being the primary victims. It's basically the same format, and people unfamiliar with the genre often confuse the two series. But one thing that Friday the 13th did was make its death scenes more memorable. That's Tom Savini's special effects again, the most famous being the arrow through Kevin Bacon. Another thing, Friday the 13th made the camp setting a very popular setting for many slasher flicks. Out in the woods, the killer could be behind any tree. The killer in the first film is not Jason Voorhees, and he never wears the famous hockey mask until part 3, but about 10 sequels later, he's one of the most famous horror movie characters to date. Jason's badass, and a lot of that is due to the stunt work of Kane Hodder. Damn, Jason gets all fucked up. Jason's been to New York City, to hell, to outer space, and he's fought Freddy Krueger. Oh, Freddy Krueger. We'll get to him next. Every kid from the 80s remembers being scared to death of Freddy Krueger. He was so terrifying and so real at the same time. Just the idea of a killer that murders people in their dreams. When are you more vulnerable than when you're asleep? If you're not familiar with the Nightmare on Elm Street series, Freddy comes into your dreams, and if you die in the dream, you die in real life. Not only does he kill people, he preys on their fear, and he enjoys it. Unlike Michael Myers and Jason Voorhees, Freddy has a face, a voice, and a witty personality. Even though the movie came out to cash in on the slasher flick franchise, it takes a completely original approach, balancing the line between horror and mild comedy. The dream concept just opened up all kinds of possibilities. Anything can happen in a dream, so each movie had fresh ideas of what Freddy could do. And they also continued to blur the line between dream and reality. Often the characters wouldn't know whether they're awake or asleep, which would deliberately confuse the audience, so they really have a surreal quality to them. The series ran its course, but made an icon out of Freddy Krueger. One thing really cool, unlike Michael Myers or Jason, who are played by many different actors throughout the sequels, Freddy was played by Robert Englund every time. He's the man. But one of the most outrageous of all the horror franchises is the Evil Dead trilogy. To this day, there are few that are able to balance humor, horror, atmosphere, innovative special effects, and creative camera work. The plot of the Evil Dead movies is not about zombies or a killer, but a book. The Book of the Dead, centuries old, inked in blood, bound in human flesh, and with the power to summon all kinds of crazy monsters. There are no rules to these movies, anything can happen. The first Evil Dead was made independently, low budget, filmed in an abandoned cabin. It relied on atmosphere and chills, suspense, and shocking scenes of grotesque dismemberment, creature effects, and bloodshed. The stop motion sequence at the end is definitely a highlight. And how many movies have you seen where somebody gets raped by a tree? But Evil Dead 2, that's where things really pick up. Director Sam Raimi comes up with a lot of really interesting camera moves, a trademark of his which he'd employ on his Spider-Man movies. The camera just flies all over the place, sometimes breaking windows. There's one great scene where it breaks the window of a car and it comes through the front. There's also times when it goes through the entire cabin from the front door to the back. We assume it's a point of view shot, but we never find out what the hell it is that's chasing them. But that only adds to the mystery and comedy as well. Bruce Campbell returns in his role as Ash, taking more than double the abuse and bringing more personality to the role. His character alternates between good and evil, and in a schizophrenic frenzy, he just puts up one hell of a battle. Don't you just hate it when your hand starts acting up? What do? You gotta show it who's boss. Cut that bastard off. Of course, the rest of the movie, he's got a chainsaw attached to his arm. You don't fuck with somebody with a gun and a chainsaw. That's badass. Evil Dead 2 is a fine mix of action, horror, and comedy. The ending leaves Ash in a time warp to the 13th century. Evil Dead 3, or The Medieval Dead, would end up being called Army of Darkness because the producers wanted it to appeal to a wider audience. Unfortunately, most people didn't appreciate its slapstick humor, but fans like me consider it to be one of the funniest movies ever made. By now, there's not a whole lot of horror, it's more like an action comedy, but it's great. The character of Ash is now fully developed. He's one of the few heroes to balance the line of being badass and being an asshole at the same time. All he wants to do is get back to his own time period, but he's stuck having to save the kingdom from the Deadites. The wise man tells Ash that he has to retrieve the book from the sacred place, but he has to say the correct magic words. The words were actually taken from the 1951 classic, The Day the Earth Stood Still, so Ash has to say these words or else all hell is going to break loose. But when he gets there, he forgets. The whole joke is that we're stuck with this incompetent hero. The last scene involves a huge epic battle with the dead, and since the days of Ray Harryhausen, stop-motion skeletons are always awesome. The Evil Dead trilogy is a huge fan favorite of the whole genre. Describing the appeal of these movies can't be done unless you see them, but there's one word that can sum it up: groovy. Throughout this era, many new monsters were established, all starting their own series. We had Leatherface, Michael Myers, Jason Voorhees, Freddy Krueger, Pinhead, Chucky, Leprechaun. All these characters have made their mark on movie history. But near the end of the 80s, a little movie came out called The Monster Squad, which brought back all the classic monsters: Dracula, the Mummy, the Wolfman, the Creature from the Black Lagoon, and Frankenstein's monster. All of them perfectly recognizable, but all with a fresh makeover, in color, and with a contemporary setting. Not only is it a reunion of these monsters, but the first time I believe they've all been featured in a live-action movie. The Monster Squad is just an ordinary group of kids with a clubhouse and a tree, but they gotta save the world from monsters. Sounds corny, but for all the right reasons. This is a fun movie. The special effects are great, the spooky scenery is just right on, the comedy's great, everything just fits into place. It also has one of the most famous movie lines since It's Alive. You know a werewolf can only be killed by, no, not a kick in the nards, but a silver bullet. Now, did you ever wonder what would happen if you cut off a werewolf's head or blew him up? Well, this is the first movie to explain that. He just comes back together. The first time I saw that, I think I pissed myself. The movie has an awkward balance. It tries to be a family film, but at the same time, not quite. But it's a unique mix of comedy and horror, and for a while it was a rare cult favorite, but today it's starting to get the recognition it deserves. Well, after Monster Squad, throughout the 90s and 2000s, we began to see modern remakes of all the classic monsters one after another. Bram Stoker's Dracula, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Wolf, The Mummy, Hollow Man, Phantom of the Opera, another monster reunion in Van Helsing, and even a remake of Creature from the Black Lagoon is on the way, proving that the classic monsters never die. Every Halloween you see them everywhere, in TV commercials, costume stores, cereal boxes, and all kinds of merchandise. But if you're in the mood for a fun monster movie, gather around with some popcorn and put on The Monster Squad. Before Peter Jackson was making some of the longest movies ever made, he was making some of the goriest movies ever made. And as we've seen in our history of horror films, the genre started out pretty tame. Psycho shocked the world with its stabbing scene. Night of the Living Dead pushed the boundaries even further with its flesh-devouring zombies. Dawn of the Dead took it to the extreme and in color. The Evil Dead movies exaggerate the blood count and make comedy out of it. But then comes along the masterpiece, which is Brain Dead, a movie that brought the gore factor to indescribable heights, which still hasn't been surpassed. Brain Dead, for whatever reason, is called Dead Alive in North America, but whether you know it as Brain Dead or Dead Alive, I can assure you it'll blow your mind. One personal highlight of mine is a creature baby getting the shit kicked out of it. Then there's the Kung Fu Priest. Now, I'm a little unsure where to go with this review, but all I can say is that it's the goriest movie I ever saw, and that's saying a lot. Think of the most horrifying, grisly, bloody, sick fuck of a movie you can possibly think of. Then look at Brain Dead. Now, whatever you were just thinking of looks like the Care Bears. Here's another way I can describe it. Imagine 5 gallons of blood being pumped a second. And think of this, movie theaters supplied barf bags. You ever heard of Lord of the Rings? Well, this is Lord of Gore. And seriously, it's fucking nasty. I'm speechless every time I see it. Bravo. Goriest film ever. Director Wes Craven sort of established himself as a prime leader in the slasher franchise. Nightmare on Elm Street introduced Freddy Krueger and spawned many sequels throughout the 80s. Wes Craven was barely involved with these sequels, but in 1994 he returned to the series with Wes Craven's New Nightmare. Not only did the film finish off Freddy and keep him dead for nearly a decade, but it also had a self-awareness to it. The movie centers around the film crew making the movie as Freddy becomes real. It's a strange notion of how horror movies could affect those who create it. Shortly after cleaning his hands of Freddy, Wes Craven decides to put an end to the slasher genre itself. Scream kinda rides on the same idea as New Nightmare. It's a horror movie that tries to be self-aware that the characters in the film itself know the cliches. Often people dismissed horror movies for being so cliche, but now they were being celebrated. Just like how Psycho made people look twice when they take a shower and Jaws made people stay out of the water, Scream made people get caller ID. The killer in the movie wears a typical Halloween mask that was already common before the film came out. It was based on the famous painting The Scream. By having such a common mask made it really generic and anonymous that the killer could be almost anybody. Scream obviously didn't end the slasher franchise, and because it was so fucking popular, instead it resurrected the genre. It had 2 sequels, a ton of crappy teen horror comedies, and a string of scary movie parodies followed. But one good thing it did was bring the audience's attention back to the original slasher movies, now classics. For example, it was in Scream when a new generation learned that Jason wasn't the killer in the first Friday the 13th. Though I think Scream was very overrated in my personal opinion, still I can't deny that the modern perception of the slasher genre owes a lot to it. You ever hear this bar, the Titty Twister? Well, don't go there, it's all vampires. From Dusk Till Dawn was the first horror movie to combine the brilliant writing and acting of Quentin Tarantino with the creative directing and camera work of Robert Rodriguez. The movie starts off pretty serious in tone, involves 2 criminals on the run who take some hostages and flee to Mexico, and when they get there they stop at a bar which turns out is run by vampires. Up till this point, nothing supernatural has occurred. We're halfway into the movie and it's turned into a drive-in horror flick. But that's what makes it cool. Unfortunately, many people hate to be taken by surprise and dislike anything unconventional. This is a movie you're not supposed to take seriously. You just sit back and enjoy. If you can't see the humor in Tom Savini playing a character called Sex Machine with a cock gun strapped on his crotch, then oh well. The last half is an epic battle with the undead and a display of awesome special effects. Heads explode, vampires melt, vampires burn, vampires turn into rats, vampires get impaled on a table, a heart gets ripped out and stabbed with a pencil, vampires die in all kinds of ways. They decided that the vampires bleed green because it was easier to pass censorship. The MPAA has no problem with loads of blood, they just hate the color red. It's also interesting to note that the kid doesn't even survive. In fact, as Tarantino says on the commentary, he gets it worse than anybody. The violence during the vampire half is exaggerated and fun, while the violence in the first half of the movie shows very little, but it's disturbing. It may be for this reason many people feel that the second half ruined it, but the way to think of it is almost like 2 different films bridged together in the middle by an amazing dance by Salma Hayek. It has no purpose in the story, but I don't think anybody complained. From Dusk Till Dawn is an important part in our history of horrors for breaking the rules, kicking some ass, and referencing the classics. 10 years later, we saw Robert Rodriguez's Planet Terror and Tarantino's Death Proof done in the style of 70s exploitation horror movies and released as a double feature entitled Grindhouse. Both films are now on DVD and prove that these guys know horror. Let's hope they make some more. We know that horror movies aren't real, but then comes along a horror movie in a documentary format actually suggesting that it is real. The last broadcast details the events of a cable access show, Fact or Fiction, in which the hosts venture into the Pine Barrens of southern New Jersey to find the legendary Jersey Devil. They all end up being murdered except for one member of the group, and as a result, he's convicted of the murders. But throughout the movie, we examine their video, and one after another, we uncover evidence that he may not be the killer. What makes it effective is the build-up. It's just a big puzzle slowly coming together, and we eagerly await what the outcome will be. It has a really unsettling mood, and that monotone voice of the narrator just enhances that. The last broadcast started a new wave of reality horror, most notably the Blair Witch Project, which brought independent horror back into the mainstream with the same successful gimmick in pretending that it was real. The last broadcast was also shot all on digital video, paving the way for independent filmmakers, and it was the first movie to be broadcast to theaters by satellite, making it an important part in our history of horror films and cinema in general. Hey, we got Elvis, a black JFK, and a mummy in boots and a cowboy hat that sucks souls out of people's assholes. It's Bubba Hotep. Okay, this one's not too important to the horror genre, but it's really funny, so I wanted to give myself a break and do something fun. In Bubba Hotep, Bruce Campbell plays a present-day Elvis who is alive and in a retirement home. Nobody knows he's the real Elvis, because he switched places with an Elvis impersonator to escape all the public attention. So the impersonator died, not him. Now there's another guy in the retirement home played by Ozzie Davis who claims to be JFK. Whether he's really JFK or just out of his mind, that's up to the audience. Personally, I find it funnier that he's crazy. Alright, so now there's a mummy. Yes, a mummy comes to suck the souls from the residents of the retirement home, and they gotta stop it. Now, putting these three characters together seems quite random at first, but there's actually a theme going on. Elvis was the king of rock and roll, JFK was the president of the United States, and the mummy was the pharaoh of Egypt. All these characters were a leader in some way, and all of them are supposed to be dead. So altogether, it's kind of like their last chance at life. As ridiculous as the plot is, it's actually quite well made. If you get the chance, check it out. Bubba Hotep, Bubba Hotep, Bubba Hotep. As the madness comes to an end, I just want to let you know that it was a lot of work to put all this together, so I'm going to try to make this day easy. What I'm going to do is recap on the state of horror movies in the new millennium. Well, in 1999, a movie came out called The Sixth Sense. I'm sure you heard of it. It was largely successful due to a twist ending, but it's also one of the most successful films ever made and one of the few horror movies to get all kinds of awards. Then in 2000, The Exorcist was re-released in theaters with restored scenes. It proved in this day and age that it's still one of the most terrifying movies ever made. In 2002, we saw 28 Days Later, a movie that made zombies scary all over again. It even brought back the genre. There's been a remake of Dawn of the Dead, a brilliant spoof, Shaun of the Dead, and George Romero, the man who started it all, comes back with Land of the Dead, the fourth in his series, which began with Night of the Living Dead, of course. And speaking of the classics, it seems at this point almost every classic horror movie has been remade. The turn of the century's been polluted with remakes. Remakes of movies that aren't even that old, remakes of movies that have already been remade, remakes of sequels, remakes of really famous movies, remakes of less famous ones, and prequels. It's no doubt that originality has been down the shitter, but if you look in the right spots, there's still some refreshing and scary movies out there. The Japanese horror movies like Ringu and Ju-on, they've been remade in America as The Ring and The Grudge. Still, it's pretty freaky stuff. Cabin Fever was a return to the camp format, but instead of a killer, it's a disease. Despite being a pretty suspenseful and balls-to-the-wall horror flick, this movie is universally hated because of one small scene involving a kid screaming pancakes. Devil's Rejects was one of my favorites in recent years. Definitely a real sick, demented movie, but one with great characters. Rob Zombie's been making a name for himself in the horror business. Some may be hit or miss, but he's one to watch. Slither was another pretty good one. It was like a modern-day 50s monster movie, but done really well and with a lot of gross special effects, which were awesome. Horror movies would continue to grow more and more violent. With series like the Saw and the Hostel movies, there's almost a new torture genre. The first two Saw movies I thought were actually pretty good, but by now I think we should all be desensitized by this shit. But, you know, people like to be scared or disgusted because nothing compares to the horrors of real life. You turn on the news every day, that's the real horror movie right there. So it's all about escaping the real world. It's fantasy. Today, the horror genre is more popular than ever. New horror films come out in theaters like every other weekend, and tons are released straight to DVD. Independent filmmakers are making them, everybody's making them, and they usually make above average profits for below average budgets. So I know I left a lot of movies out of my little recap here and out of my whole history as well. It was hard to pick which ones to review, so I usually stuck to the real famous ones. But there's a ton of others I could have done, so maybe sometime in the future I can review some more, but it was a lot of work, and to tell you the truth, I'm glad to be done. So I hope you enjoyed this. I did it just because it was something I wanted to do, and I'm a really big fan of horror movies, and I just wanted to share my knowledge of it. So have a great Halloween, and signing out, this is Cinemassacre's Monster Madness. I'll see you later.